So welcome to the final Russian cinema research group of this year, which we're once again dedicating to Ukrainian cinema for a few reasons: to celebrate the centenary on 13th of March 2020 of the creation of Vuvku, to offer a symbolic gesture in support of Ukrainian national independence, the territorial integrity of Ukraine's borders, and the distinctiveness of Ukrainian national culture in the light of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, and to offer solidarity also to Ukraine's appeals to boycott provisionally screenings of Russian Federation films at festivals and other types of events. So we're really delighted to introduce tonight Dr. Olga Bryukhovetska, who's going to speak to us with a paper titled "Two Absent Funerals: The Work of Mourning, Traumatic Effects and Torn Identity in Ukrainian Poetic Cinema of the 1960s. Olga is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine, where she teaches courses on film theory and visual culture. Her research focuses on the political dimensions of visuality and the integration of traumatic experience. She's participated in numerous research projects with some really fascinating titles, including Memory at War, Cultural Dynamics in Poland, Russia and Ukraine, Gender Check, Femininity and Masculinity in the Art of Eastern Europe, Former West, Art and the Contemporary after 1989, The Ukrainians, and 10 Things Everyone Should Know About Ukraine. This last project was run by the Ukrainian Institute here in London, and Olga contributed a video essay titled Ukrainian Cinema, Giving a Voice to the Silent, which discusses the ways in which the cinema of Parajanov, Kira Muratova, and Miroslav Shlapopitsky captures the plight of marginalized peoples and gives a voice to the silenced. It's an interesting short video. I'll put a link to the chat in a moment. Olga publishes in Ukrainian and English, and her English language texts have appeared in Artit, Red Thread, Kino Kultura, Apparatus, Freeze, and L'Internationale. And I think she's currently working on a book-length study of Parajanov. Her most recent text in English, Time and Again, addresses the war in Ukraine. And again, I'll put a link to this powerful piece in the chat in a moment. So I really want to thank Olga very much for accepting our invitation to speak to us tonight, given the unimaginably difficult circumstances that she's been living and working in over the past 3 months. So Olga is speaking to us from Kyiv. She decided to remain in Kyiv when Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. But when drinking water started to become scarce in the city and the Russian bombardments increased, she was forced to leave her home and travel to the west of Ukraine, joining the ranks of the millions of internally displaced people whose lives have been turned upside down by Russia's brutal war. Olga returned to Kyiv just 2 weeks ago, and so she's back there now. So welcome, Olga. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a generous introduction, and for thank you for all your group for this very important gesture of solidarity. And I would like to thank every person who is having that solidarity with Ukraine. It's extremely important for us. It gives us power to fight, and together we will win. I have no doubts about that. And I would like to start with the notes on the first seminar that Yuri Shevchuk had 2 weeks ago, which was extremely fascinating and interesting topic of Ukrainian language. But I would like to kind of bring a more subtle perspective on this highly important topic. However, I will start with the kind of harsh comment, which I think during this black and white period of war, we all got used to. Maybe in a peaceful time, it won't sound so bad. But I would like to first address the question of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And I think that will be the ongoing topic in Ukraine over the time. And I think the language is organic category, and people should have a choice on their own to decide which language they speak, despite that we have to deal with the results of long-term Russification. But I think at this present moment, any question of Russian-speaking Ukrainian just ends when we start thinking of those Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are fighting at the forefront and who are dying for Ukraine. And especially for those who love Ukraine remotely, this should be considered as a very important moment, not to exclude from being Ukrainian those who speak Russian at the moment. And I do not know how things will develop in society. I'm native speaking Ukrainian, and I knew those phases of humiliation, rejection, then interest, then fascination. And I think society should go through this traumatic experience of being disconnected from its own language, its own culture, in a slow and very gentle way. There is no way to impose this change. It only can be sustained in a very graceful and supportive way. That's, I think, how culture thrives the most. And the other more extended remark, or like kind of continuation of that discussion that Yuri initiated on the first Ukrainian seminar, I would like to pose a question: what is Ukrainian cinema? And that's, I think, something that we will have to deal with looking back at the time of Soviet era, and maybe even before that, the time when Ukraine was kind of dependent or colonized by Russian culture, and so and had to deal with that circumstance. So what I'm going to present is maybe a more nuanced way of looking at Ukrainian cinema generally, and then I will proceed to go to my two funerals, which I assume would be just one funeral for the sake of time saving, but I think it's still very important to start the Ukrainian seminars by making this more general overview of what can be seen as Ukrainian cinema, especially of the Soviet time. If we try to make general characteristic of Ukrainian Soviet film or cinema, it can barely be captured by certain common quality or the stylistic automatic level, on the stylistic automatic level. Yet this general characteristic can be defined at the level of the film production as a dependent or colonial situation to which a number of responses existed. And I think that kind of level of generalization actually brings a wider perspective and possibility to look at the Ukrainian cinema. Indeed, the defining character of Ukrainian film production since the demise of Vuvku in 1930 was the limits and pressures imposed on it by the politics of Russian cultural imperialism. This politics manifested itself on institutional level as a subjugation of whole production process to Moscow organs. Goskino, starting from 1963, and all its previous versions and predecessors. Without the permission of Goskino or other Moscow bodies of power, it was not possible neither to launch a film production in Ukraine, nor to release a film. The politics of Russian cultural imperialism I'm sorry, I used the wrong word, but I'll try to improvise. They pressured with certain demands on the content of Ukrainian films as well, not only on the production process. But the borders were fuzzy and not stable, and they changed over time. That also should be taken into consideration. Ukrainian cinema, as well as Ukrainian culture in general, during Soviet time particularly, was developing in the context of what David Brandenberger aptly called Russo-centric elitism, a very distinct version of Soviet modernization in which Russian people were presented as the most progressive nation, leading other Soviet nations to the radiant future, and in which, of course, communism spoke Russian. And now I would like to bring a kind of more complicated vision to this general outline. And in order to do that, I'll use the very famous and British originated model of encoding decoding proposed by Stuart Hall in 70s, which is somewhat abstract, of course, yet helpful for the general overview. So according to this model, using this model, we can define 3 types of responses to the situation of the Russian cultural imperialism that were developed in Ukrainian cinema. And I assume this approach, this kind of way of responding the situation and response can be easily extended to other national republics, although I have to say I also do not know that much about the exact differences and circumstances there. The first response, so-called dominant hegemonic response, those are the films that fully transmit an ideology of Russian cultural imperialism. Then there is the second, it's very tricky category, a negotiated response. There are these films have the markers of local difference that are inscribed in the ideology of Russian cultural imperialism in its Soviet version. And those local differences can be labeled either as a stereotypes or, I think more productively, as a kind of turbulent zones that still exist within this more or less monolithic constructions. And there is a third response to the situation of the Russian cultural imperialism, and that's the oppositional or counter-hegemonic. This response undermines the very core of Russo-centric atatism. And the major example of such oppositional response is the Ukrainian Poetic Cinema of 60s and early 70s, which would be the subject of my talk. I would also want to refer to Joshua First and his very helpful distinction between the folkloric and ethnographic modes of representation of Ukrainian identity, and I assume that would also apply to other Soviet republics and the ways they presented their identity. The folkloric mode reifies the ethnic specificity, presenting it as a purely decorative element. It forms this domesticated version of difference, either an empty shell with the socialist content or some sort of what Yuri Shevchuk referred to as funny Ukrainian. On the contrary, the ethnographic mode of representation animates this ethnic difference as an alterity, which becomes dangerously free and assumes the agency of its own, but not in terms of another version of Russian Russo-centric modernity, but as an eccentric difference which exists independently of the center. In this case, the funny Ukrainian becomes a strange Ukrainian, or even a queer Ukrainian. The distinction of the 2 modes of cultural ethnic difference, of representing this difference, which is proposed by Joshua First, is compatible, I think, with Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model, however the formulaic it is. And we can see in folkloric mode of representation a form of a negotiated response, while ethnographic mode is a form of oppositional response. The dominant response would be the one totally erasing cultural difference, dissolving it into Russian hegemonic identity without a residue. This will fit perfectly to what Yuri Shevchuk referred as a depopulation. However, one has to be careful to use this somewhat simplistic model, and we need to avoid a reductive vision in which, for example, Muratova gets equated with Mikhalkov. I think it is productive at this stage to introduce one more mode, that of disidentification, which was elaborated in queer studies by such scholars as Diana Fus and Jose Esteban Munoz. And this will help us to capture a complexity of Muratova's response. As is well known, Munoz insisted that this identification is a form of oppositional response of the most marginalized subjects. And I think that the woman filmmaker in Soviet Union, although without feminist background and a kind of bisexual queer subject and ethnically different person, can definitely choose to use that kind of response of disidentification. And I think that would be a much more productive way to look at Muratova's way of responding rather than equating her with this hegemonic imperialist project, of which she was really not a part. In fact, regarding her attitude toward Ukrainian language and culture, it of course changed over the time, and actually the way she changed also her attitude toward feminism and other issues. But I remember some time ago, really long time ago, have an interview with her during the Molodist Film Festival in Kyiv, and I remember speaking Ukrainian, and it was totally fine with her. So I think sometimes she can use this as a pretext to show her temper. Maybe I do not know to kind of speculate on this. But back to and kind of linking this short introduction of how I see that it is more productive to talk about Ukrainian cinema, to include the question of language in the wider question of the what would be the Russian imperialism and its project of Russo-centric elitism, and what would be the subject of that project, and how we can talk without being reductive. I would also want to make a link to the films that I would like to talk about. And I would like to suggest that those films, beside A Shadow of Forgotten Ancestors by Sergey Parajanov, shot in 1965 or released in 1965, and Stone Cross by Leonid Osyka, that was released in 1968, that those films that usually are seen as the kind of the staples of Ukrainian identity can also be read as the texts that perform disidentification. And the ethnographic quality of these films, which is undisputable and which contributed to the great success and the tragic fate in Soviet time and the tragic fate of those filmmakers, can be enriched and interpreted without this essentialist concepts of national identity. And that will be the task that I have in front of me in the rest of the presentation. But before I go to this task, which is quite difficult and kind of counter-hegemonic, I would say, I would like to have a few remarks on the method which I'm using. My interest to film is quite eccentric, I would say, but I do have kind of sympathy to the comparison of film and dream, which is not very popular at film studies now. And that's how I'm approaching films, as a kind of collective dreams that can be interpreted and read. But to talk about this in a more acceptable language, I would say that film is a document of the imaginary of a certain historical epoch, but it also is a document for our present imaginary as well. As Andrei Bazin aptly said, the photographic image is a hallucination, which is also a fact. And I think for me, the most important part in dealing with film matter is this kind of sensitivity to the articulation of the oniric and empiric, to use another important theoretician and practitioner of cinema, Pier Paolo Pasolini, who I think is the closest filmmaker to Parajanov, and whom Parajanov called his spiritual brother. And this kind of approach allows us to see in film certain layers of sense, which were transmitted as an evidence for the trial of future, and which can be peeled one after the other and seen as a kind of patterns, very complicated patterns that we can unfold. And that's what I'm going to try to demonstrate today. But still another note on method, this kind of complicated patterns and layers and the double quality of cinema, which produces this document of imaginary, becomes particularly evident if we read films not only closely, and that's my attitude to cinema. I usually tend to focus on some key moments of the films rather than on the story or characters or all this human egocentric kind of part of the cinema. But also if we read films symptomatically, allowing the multiplicities of senses and they contradictory relation to each other to be released. The task of such reading is not to develop a unity of meaning and not to build a kind of story, narrative or meta-narrative, but to quote Pierre Machery, its task would be measuring a distance which separates different meanings from each other. Such reading is focused not on the story, but on the gaps, on ruptures, on interstices within and within, around, and between the meanings. The most productive instances of such reading would be the cases of meaningful absences. And I truly believe that film always exposes more than it intends to show, and it's particularly interesting when this more is located in the negative space of absence. So let's move to the first case, which I assume will be the only case for today's seminar, the shadows of forgotten ancestors. My next section dedicated to passions / affects. And this is something that I, knowingly that this is somewhat fragmentary way of proceeding in my presentation, I would like to emphasize as another very important layer for the film of Parajanov, for the shadows of forgotten ancestors, which are usually seen as an ethnographic film about Ukrainian identity, or the Romeo and Juliet in Carpathian Mountains. Far from those quite legitimate versions of interpreting the film, I think that those are the kind of upper level layers of the film. Parajanov himself, who got tired of accusations in exoticism, quite often paradoxically claimed that there is nothing exotic in the shadows. He particularly said that in an interview to Larissa Pogrebna, and she published this in her book on the film adaptation of Mikhailo Kotsubinski in 1971. And she was generous enough to include a quote. And we know Parajanov's speech is extremely powerful in terms that he never is shying away from contradictions and really develops his thought. And to make a side remark, it's very sad that all those KGB observants who wrote a lot of extensive reports on what Parajanov told during his life, that we don't have access to those reports. It's very well known that there were a lot of them, but unfortunately, Kyiv KGB archives do not have that file. And hopefully it was not destroyed in the 90s, but transferred to Moscow. This were two kind of destinies of the KGB archives on the brink of Ukrainian independence. They were either destroyed for the famous people, either destroyed or sent to Moscow. So if anyone is working on Moscow KGB archives, please take a look at if there is a Parajanov case, because it might have tons of amazing stuff. But we have some parts here and there of what he was saying. And in that book, Larissa Pogrebna, who is a literary critic, young literary critic working in Kyiv, she included his citation, and it's amazing form of Parajanian dialectics, which goes from one to the other. But I will just summarize his point, which is in which he's saying, he's insisting that there is nothing exotic in shadows. From the point of view of Hutsus, he kind of corrects himself, not from your urban person point of view. And he introduces the perspective of Hutsus as the equal and an alternative subject of vision. And this is a very important point, and I have to add to this my observations of being around Hutsus in 2015 in the village Verkhovina, and where the film was partly shot. This was the celebration of 50th anniversary of film release. And it was striking for me that Hutsus talk about this film very differently that we people from Kyiv talk about this film. When we talk in Kyiv, here in Kyiv, about the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, we say that this film was the film that opened Ukraine for the world. That was the first time that the world saw Ukrainian film, which was not very easy to call Russian. Even Dovzhenko could be quite often labeled as Russian filmmaker, but with that film, with Shadows, very few cases. There were some cases, but mostly that was so not like Russian that world had to find about Ukraine. But Hutsul say very different things. They say that this film opened Hutsul region for Ukraine and for the world. So their perspective, and that's a conscious choice on the side of Parajanov, as well as Osyka, who did a kind of response to Parajanov in a very interesting way, to go to the margins of Ukraine. And it's not a core of Ukraine, it's not Ukrainian identity, it's this Ukrainian alterity and difference that manifests itself in those films. I think that part goes to the torn identity, which is, if we take Lacanian lessons seriously, this is any identity. And if we look at the kind of desperate search for Ukrainian identity or any national identity, I think that gives us a good lesson that we should take easy with any essentialist approach to this question. So Parajanov suggests to her interlocutor, young Ukrainian literary critic Larisa Pogrebna, that in order to see what Hutsuls see without any exotic kind of illusion around this film, the way that that it is part of their culture, she has to watch the film at least 6 times, which is a kind of good tricky way of filmmaker to attract his audience. And he suggests that she needs to peel the layer of this exoticism over and over to be able to experience the matter of the film. And what is this matter of the film? Parajanov insists that the matter of his film is passions. And I would say he is using them both in a kind of Christian way, but also in a way that affective turn that is going on in humanities and political science and social science is talking about affects in this kind of Bergsonian, Deleuzian way of the energies that pass through and around the subject. Kind of pre-individual energies, passions. The same moment, the same point Parajanov makes over and over, even in his much more famous and probably well-read article, which is by far the single of his written piece, but definitely the most well-known, which is called Eternal Return, which was published in 1965. In 1966, I'm sorry, 1 year after Shadow's release in Moscow journal Искусство кино. He insists, between the many other stories and things he says in this very orally written text, he insists that his film is first and foremost about passions, conveyed in word, in melody, in tangible things, and in color. I think that this was very important for Parajanov, and I would not develop here his attitude toward language, which was a matter for him, and which has this material dimension of voice and modulation and all the other things that were kind of the living constitutions of energy. And if you look at Parajanov's film, the things, the colors, the voices are vibrating in this very complicated form and creating those juxtaposed patterns. That's how he was thinking, and you see it in Shadows, you see it in his early Ukrainian films, which is, I think, something that should be rediscovered, because they're considered to be like nasty, bad failures, but and they are monsters, but they're very interesting monsters. And of course, you see it in his films after Parajanov became sort of Parajanov in his later films. This kind of core matter of passions and affects in Parajanov films does not devalue the ethnographic quality of Shadows, but rather helps to penetrate it layer by layer in order to reanimate our numbed sensorium. And I think the pre-modern exoticism is not the goal of itself for Parajanov. Neither is, of course, the decoration on the surface of a kind of modern melodrama, for which Parajanov coined a nasty word, tenism, in English shadowism, And he referred to many films that were imitating shadows as a kind of this superficial shadowism that brings this kind of modern narrative, the melodramatic narrative, and puts it in this kind of exotic setting or costumes. Parajanov uses ethnographic material in order to awake us to the ability to experience the sensory richness of the life more fully in all its affective density, which and that ability to experience it. And of course, I'm thinking about Benjamin at this moment and his interpretation. That ability of aura and of sensorium, that ability to experience this kind of richness and fullness gets numbed in a modern urban environment. And I think the major role that Parajanov plays is that of a healer of our senses through this kind of film that you should watch many times, more than 6, at least I did, much more than 6 times. At the same time, what Parajanov looks for in this alterity, which he refuses to define as subalterity, I'm talking about Hutsuls, but also the main character of the film, and I'm doing now this slightly Parajanovit gesture of contradicting myself, are the repressed effects of modernity. He turns this world of alterity in an alter ego of Soviet modernity. And he does it as an invitation to explore, invitation to us to explore our conflicting passions, which we are not able to handle in the everyday reality. The passions in the film are produced and repressed by Soviet modernity. So the shadows is actually not about some Hutsul culture, the ethnographic kind of document of that culture. It is about us. It is about our kind of ability to recognize ourselves in that film. These passions are possible to experience only in a mode of disowning them, at least for the audience of the 60s, but I assume today as much, and projected onto alterity. So I'm now making next section of my talk, of my presentation, which is dedicated to traumatic memory. And I'm quite traumatized by the lack of time. And please let me know if I, because I'm still kind of in the process of developing the major point.
You're fine for time, don't worry, take as much time as you need.
That's wonderful. So now I would like to talk about the absent funeral, at least the one, and unfinished work of mourning and this traumatic memory. So the passions, the effects of Soviet modernity, the one that we cannot recognize, or we were not able to recognize back then, are also referred to this repressed memory of victims of Holodomor, of Great Terror, of Holocaust, and other atrocities. And those unworked traumatic passions manifest themselves as ruptures and meaningful absences in these two films, but I will talk only about the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And I would argue that this is possible exactly because these two films were based on the literary sources that preceded those traumatic events. And those literary sources, which are the Mikhailo Kotsubinski novel of the same title, The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors from 1911, and the two short stories of Vasyl Stefanik in the case of Leonid Osyka, who also wrote like in late 19th and early 20th century, before the October Revolution, before all these events. And that usage of literary resources was a kind of alibi for those filmmakers to work with the texts in a way to be able to introduce those new meanings over the literary resource original text. And that opens a very interesting question of the impurity of time in those films, because we do not have the history as a linear time there, but we have a history of the kind of loops and holes that repeat and that go backwards and forward at the same time. The interpretation that I would like to give of one particular moment in the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestor has to do with the negative space of significant absence. That absence which is present as a kind of pressure on a story that disrupts it and creates a fold or gap or whatever you call, but it's the kind of symptom. And the symptom is overlooked. I was able to notice it, or it came to my conscious after many times I watched the film, and at the same time, I remembered that I had that question from the very first time, which of course I don't remember which was the first. I had that question, but it somehow was always kind of passing by until I posed it seriously. And that's, for those who watch the film, is the question of where does mother of the main character disappear? What happens to her? And this brings us to the kind of the rule of the film that Parajanov created, which is quite different from Kozyubinsky's novel. The Parajanov's film, and I should probably at this point show the title of my presentation, just to make a difference, to make a kind of visual variety, and that's the, it has this moment, it captures this moment of Nina Alisova last appearance in the film. And that's the moment where I always was wondering, so what happens to her? Where does he disappear? And the question, this question is not just something that we pose about any kind of not important character in the film. We usually don't ask where those kind of side characters disappear, although you cannot really quietly call her character the side character. She has a quite extensive role, unlike the roles the mother has in the Kozyubinsky novel. But the legitimacy of this question has to do with this Parajanov's structure of the film, which he builds around the funerals. First of all, the three major funerals of the father of Ivan, which is just a beautiful procession shot on the snow with the mother cries and with all the beauty and horror of the death. Then the second funeral, the funeral of beloved Marichka, who dies very similarly to Ophelia, and her funerals have those associations with Shakespeare, and which is, of course, again, very unlikely to what very different from what was in Kozyubinsky novel. And then the funeral of Ivan himself, which ends the film. One might add to this kind of centrality of funerals in the film, the funeral of Oleksa, the elder brother of the main character, who famously dies in the prologue by this spectacular shot from the top of the fallen tree that kills him. And there is a cross set up as the very first shot of the film. So no person that has any significance in the film disappears without trace. And this is something that I have to emphasize, brought to this material by Parajanov and even by Parajanov solely, because the film script that he co-wrote with Ivan Chendey, the more kind of realistically inclined Western Ukrainian writer, didn't have that centrality of funerals in it. The novel, Kotsubinski's novel, is structured totally differently. As Ukrainian American literary scholar Bogdan Rubchak wrote in a very brilliant essay, The Music of Saturn and the Bedeviled World, dedicated to Kotsubinski's writing. It's an article from 1981. The novel is punctuated by the ascensions to the mountain of the main character, and those ascensions are points of his meeting with the outside, with the external kind of non-physical world, and they are also the points of the breakthrough of creativity. And death is also part of that breakthrough. Parajanov totally changes this situation. I will stop sharing, and please let me know how much time do I have, because then I probably should make kind of some cuts in my presentation.
It's 10 to 7, but you're fine to keep talking, Olga. Just get.
That's so kind of you, thank you. So Parajanov changes the source, and he makes this basically rule of the film that there is no death without funeral. But this rule works only in a case if film knows about the death of the character, of the significant character. What if film doesn't know? What if the character simply disappears, perishes, is erased if he or she, as if he or she didn't exist at all? In his book, The Warped Mourning, Aleksander Etkind worked around those unaccounted for deaths. About people, he spoke about people erased as if they never existed. One of the key moments of such resistance to erasure, and also example of erasure, is the struggle of Nadezhda Mandelstam to figure out the exact date and circumstances of the death of her husband. And Aleksander Etkind points out very important moment, which I think is relevant today as well. The secrecy around the death of victims of a terroristic state, he suggests, created a strange paradox, as if their death is both an important state secret and an insignificant detail not worth of being mentioned. This, I think, as any Lacanian would say, that this is the point of too much and too little, the point of the classical symptom, the work of unconscious. But of course, it's a very real situation which we still face today. It will get a little bit more weird further, so I need to kind of introduce this moment of ontological turn in understanding film, and I will use the authority of Thomas Elsasser, who in his last book says that the question of film theory shifted from whether film is art to what if the film is the reality that thinks. And this is the approach that I think is the most relevant when we talk about the meaningful gaps and things that are probably not really very much in control of filmmaker, the artist, and so on and so on. So the exception of the rule, as you may imagine, about the no funeral after kind of this unknown death, is the disappearance of the mother in shadows. I have to say that there is this kind of more rational explanation of why she disappears, and that is the extension of her role comparing to the her role in the novel. In the novel, she's a kind of pipe-smoking, quiet woman, Hutu woman who just shows up in the first paragraph, shouts at her little son, kicks him out from the house, and just disappears and dissolves in the environment of this kind of eternal Hutu way of life. And this is a traditional family with extended kind of way of looking at life, with big family, with all these things. What happens in the film is totally different. We have a nuclear family, and moreover, it's kind of disordered nuclear family. If we use the title of Elizabeth Rudinesco's book, it's a family without father, which is very resonating type of family for Soviet people after the Second World War and all the terrors and all the other atrocities that happened before and after. And moreover, this is a mother who is very protective toward her son. It's a mother that holds a son very closely, and this is emphasized through the film. And we have here the very ambivalent situation where in Soviet culture, and Parajanov was part of that culture, although he obviously resisted it and famously called himself that I'm not a Soviet filmmaker. When he was asked to apply to write his bio for the film dictionary, he still holds this kind of patriarchal reverence toward mother. But this mother that he shows here, and this is also something that people usually do not notice, but she's quite a dark character. She's kind of the mother of Norman Bates, especially when we move further in the film, where she basically condemns his love, and we understand that she kills with her words, with her hatred, Marichka. That if we believe in the power of spell, which of course, if we ever believe we should do it in this film, that she has quite a direct connection to the tragedy of her son. And I think that here we have the pressure of this time of the other mother appearing over the ocean in American screen, and all these misogynic ideas after the Second World War, the generation of vipers, the strong women who are dangerous. This all is built around and built in this character. And goes totally unnoticed till today. Then another even more commonsensical explanation is that the character of mother was played by Nina Alisova, who was the real mother of Larissa Kadoshnikova, the main character of the film. So Parajanov have to kind of to extend that role, so somehow to serve the very famous at that time Larissa Kadoshnikova, kind of tracked her into the film, and all those explanations, of course, can work. But we will go for the most weird explanation, and that will we will talk about the role that mother that plays on those deepest levels where the gaps are meaningful. At this point, I think are ready to look at the final appearance of Nina Alisova in the film. And I would like to ask you to see if you can, and we will see the end of this episode and the beginning of the next episode. And I would ask you to see if you can notice something strange going on in this episode. So let me try to share the screen, and hopefully you will here in
Най
Siva.
стане пустою хата гутенюків, як і моя. Най, як і моя, згине їхня худоба. Іванку, вони знищили наш лід, а ти... Мамо! Легінь ти мій. Чи думала я, що не будеш ти газдою, а підеш у найми, заробляти на хліб? Синочку.
Мамо,
На кого ж ти мене залишаєш?
тримайтеся, мамо.
Най буде так, най
Благословіть в дорогу.
щасти. Щасти тобі, Боже. Господи, сохрани, заступи сина мого Івана і пом'яни душі дітей моїх, Михайла, Данила, Анни, Василя, Миколи, Олекси. Отче наш, іже єси на небесі, да святиться ім'я Твоє, да буде воля Твоя. Хліб наш насушний даш нам десь.
Слава Ісусу!
Навіки слава Богу!
Слава Ісусу!
Навіки слава Богу! І слава Іванку!
Дякую, пані,
Слава тобі,
дякую.
Іванку!
So I do not know if you have noticed, and the point, the symptomatic point here is the X. Ivan, when he gets the blessings of the mother, he gives the X to his mother. She holds it, and then she says prayers of all her dead children. And then in the next shot, Ivan goes with the X on his shoulder. So we have this moment where the X, which is a key symbol throughout the film, makes this strange splitting between the symbol which stays with the mother, which here embodies this both the dark, revengeful memory, the kind of really the darkest side of the containment, and the memory of the people, because she's embodies that kind of she remembers all those who disappeared and whom we haven't known. She names them by name, literally, to quote Anna Akhmatova's very famous poem, which is very kind of subtly present in shadows. And then we have the X as a simple object, an instrument on Ivan's shoulder. And this is the moment where you are not allowed to ask, was this intention of Parajanov at all? This is the moment where you have the filmic matter talking and showing and pointing to those gaps, those questions that I'm sure every viewer has when the mother stays and she asks, how am I gonna be? And she doesn't receive the answer, and that answer stays with us. And this is the point where I stop, although I really wanted to add more on the symbolism of X, which is of course which is of course another story in this film. But I will end on the quote from Adorno. And of course, we always talk about Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors and the Stone Cross as the films that are centered around authenticity, and like we may usually see the best quality of this film in this authenticity. But I would like to remind that Adorno in aesthetic theory says that scars of damage and disruption are the modern seal of authenticity. And in that deeper sense of authenticity, we should actually see both the upper layers of really precisely captured matter of the way of life of Hutus in both films, and that those deeper layers of the torn out identity, the unfinished work of mourning, of all these modern traumas and passions and all these traumatic experiences that form the true core of authenticity of those two films. And the same goes for, in a much different way, for the Stone Cross, but I will leave it for future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you very much. That was a very rich talk, really detailed, and I'm sure people have lots of questions. So there aren't any in the chat at the moment, but if anyone has a question and you'd like to ask it yourself, you can indicate by raising your hand, and I'll take them in the order that they come up. So any questions? So we'll go with Lilia and then Phil.
Sure. Hi. So thank you. That was wonderful. So I feel like you didn't quite say what you thought where you think the mother goes. In other words, where does she disappear to, or what is her disappearance? What is her disappearance? So when it happens in the film, and also, and what precisely it links to, because you mentioned all of the traumas, but you also mentioned the story that precedes the traumas. Yeah, if you could say just a few more words to kind of reconnect them together.
Thank you so much for this question. I do not have the kind of one answer to that, obviously, which I think is impossible. I think that on one side, it's if we bring the meaning toward it, which is probably not an intended meaning by the author, it would function as the erasure of memory, but it would somehow pose this strange gap that's not enough, that's not something wrong with this explanation, it's not a full explanation. But I have much more interesting answer to this question, and this is the next film by Parajanov, The Color of Pomegranate, in which he somehow compensates for this missing funeral of mother by his long procession of funeral of the mother, which is according to James Stephan, and he gave this really fascinating interpretation of three levels of maternity in the Color of Pomegranate, where there is an individual, the collective, and the heavenly maternity. And he interprets the funeral, this long and very strange procession, which I think the length of which can be explained that Parajanov was feeling there was something missing in shadows. Or he probably didn't think it consciously, but that doesn't matter, especially if we talk about Parajanov. And James Stephan, who is the kind of leading authority of Parajanov by today, I think he interprets it as the people, the sons and daughters, this collective, are mourning the mother, which embodies their collective. So it's a kind of, again, back to this trauma of the kind of core wound of destruction of people. And I think it's also very related to the Armenian experience, which is by far much more wounded than Ukrainian, at least in that time he is talking about. And I think that pain was much more deeper for him than talking about Ukrainian version. So it's a wonderful opportunity to interpret. I would say that would be my third answer.
Okay, Phil.
Okay, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk, and a really exceptionally interesting set of questions that you raise about this film, which it doesn't matter how many times you watch it, there are so many things that occur that you've never spotted before. And I have no active memory of the sequence that you've just shown us, which just goes to show how extraordinarily rich it is. What I wanted to ask you was a broader question, and it's partly based on something that Yuri Shevchuk said 2 weeks ago. And that's about Ukrainian cinema, definitions of Ukrainian cinema, and the imaginary that is related to the Ukrainian rural experience. The question I wanted to ask you really was, firstly, Kotsubinski's novel is part of the sort of ethnographic exploration of parts of Ukraine, which to many urban and city dwellers was something different, as it were, or at least something that was seen as distinctive and quintessentially Ukrainian. And so I'm interested in the fact that Yuri 2 weeks ago was sort of relatively dismissive about this this idea that somehow exploring this experience and this culture and this set of discourses and imaginary somehow was alien to the concept of modernity. And yet Shadows and Osyka's film, and also Bili Khmari, and also Ilenka's film, what is it, Blackbird with White Markings or Whitebird with Black Markings, I can't remember which variant it is, are all set in rural areas, and yet are very, very powerfully modern statements in terms of their aesthetic. So my question to you is, do you see any opposition between the subject itself and the actual modernistic aesthetic that is brought to play in these films in relation to that subject? And do you consider that to be a sort of legitimate discourse which is associated with definitions of Ukrainianness?
Thank you so much for this question, and a very important topic that you brought. I do have a very strong opinion on this, and I think that Yuri Shevchuk, a person who left Ukraine in the 90s, somehow stayed, I'm sorry to say, that in questions of 90s, and there is this idea that the peasant culture is something that is like monolithically stereotype, and we need to strive for some kind of modern identity, and that's the only way Ukraine can think about it. And I don't think Ukraine is like this anymore. There was a period of time when the association with peasants was somehow the type of colonial stereotypes, but I think at the moment, if we think about the Live Fire, for example, this beautiful documentary from 2017, if I'm not mistaken, which is a documentary film, but it's the kind of beautiful poetic documentary on the peasants shot in the same region as Parajanov was shooting, but it's a production drama. It's a story of the labor, which is also very much present in Parajanov. And so back to what Yuri Shevchuk somewhat normatively calling for Ukrainian urban identity, that was a very important kind of narrative in 90s in Ukraine. And as a kind of document of that questioning for the Ukrainian speaking urban person, which was a kind of rarity, and I was one of that rarity, and it was not an easy kind of way of navigating Ukrainian urban space, but it is not anymore. And I think that the document of that kind of 90s mood and problems is article by Bogdan Nebesok, Canadian Ukrainian film historical, which is called something like the questionable foundation of Ukrainian national cinema. And it condemns Shadows as a kind of both elitist not commercial enough, and also kind of colonial version. And there was a point in the 90s when I think the role of Yuri Ilyenko was important in that kind of equation, because he's much different than Parajanov. For me, he's actually the opposite of Parajanov. And talking about funerals, his film, the Wellspring for Thirsty, is also interesting to interpret in that respect, that there is the actual body that doesn't know, the father that doesn't know that he's dead, and there is another kind of attitude, and toward the funerals, totally different. And the whole story was, I'm sorry to go in the Ilyenko direction, but I think it gives you this kind of puzzle of complexity of Ukrainian issues, is that like his last film, the prayer for Hetman Mazepa, which was considered a failure, and some people call it the genius work and whatever, but it was definitely a big frustration for Yuri Ilyenko, who considered himself to embody this poetic tradition, which when it is privatized, it dies. So that's the problem. But back to the language difference, my relation to this film ended when I saw somewhere, like, you know, in the third hour of the film or something like this, when that I'm joking, Peter Mazepa speaks Ukrainian, Peter the Great speaks Russian, and then Karl the 12th speaks Russian as well. And that was like, you know, it's embedded, this universal language in people who are overcoming and claiming to be the true Ukrainians and all these kind of things. So it's very contradictory. And I think that the other point, so my short question to your very important answer, that I think that there is no one answer. Of course, there is a group of people in Ukraine who still holds those 90s attitude toward Ukraine, that should be Ukrainian speaking modern urban people. But since we do not have lack of that anymore, and since there are much more interesting things, I think the kind of idea that we should be shy away, or we feel shamed that there is the amazing peasant culture or horrible peasant culture, because Vasil Stefanik is presenting this horror of peasant life, the kind of strong, murderous passions running there, and he obviously had to show his own depression in that film. And also Kotsibinsky was looking for his own solutions when he got fascinated with Hutsuls, because he was escaping, and that's my interpretation, is also very eccentric toward the normative Ukrainian interpretation of what the Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors is. But I see it as a kind of why he changed the rainy Carpathian Mountains for the sunny Capri, where he spent every summer with Gorky and his friends hunting sharks and all these funny things boys do. So he found in Carpathian Mountains the solution for his deep wound, because he had wife and he had lover and he couldn't reconcile. So finally he decided to die because that was too painful. But Hutsuls are like really different. They don't have, they're kind of totally polyamoric. They have no difficulties with this kind of issues. So he wanted to understand and get the sense of that other type of life, not this Victorian Ukrainian kind of uptight morals and all these dramas of, you know, very well described by this splitting between the tender and love and sex love and all this stuff that are so messy. But he really looked for the other more healthy way of life. And I think Parajanov, who was definitely hypersexual person and really felt very comfortable in that setting, because this is a different attitude toward what life means, what kind of relations can be, how can we celebrate life and all these things. So these are very, very much more, I think, important things than the kind of national identity which is imposed on those films. And I would like to end the answer to this question with pointing out, and this is something that comes quite often, that you said that Kozyubinsky was looking for something different and quintessentially Ukrainian. And this part, the quintessentially Ukrainian, somehow showed up and persists, but I think it's unnecessary addition. It's really something that is differently, and I don't think Kozyubinsky ever was thinking about what is quintessentially Ukrainian. This comes as his fascination with alterity and otherness, and also being able to, he wrote from the very beginning on Bessarabia region, on Crimea Tatars. So he was always fascinated with these differences, and he had this social democratic, very strong political views, and he was writing about the working class, the peasants, and their struggles and their sufferings, and at the same time he has all this like heavenly passions and traumas. So I think the question of what is quintessentially Ukrainian came from the basically second half of the century, after the end of Ukrainian Thaw, which was much later than Russian or Thaw, because we had it till 1972. We had the sort of more or less liberal or very relatively Petroshalist, who was replaced by very dogmatic pro-Russian Volodymyr Shcherbitsky. And then we were told that we do not exist, and that's a very familiar thing that we keep hearing from our northern neighbor. And that question, that's like when you are told that you do not exist, then your bad response to that is to say, no, we exist because there is something quintessentially Ukrainian about us somewhere in Ukraine or somewhere else or whatever, and that's the failure from the beginning, because this is the wrong question. I mean, any identity is a torn identity, and that's okay. I don't think it's a problem.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Thank you.
Okay, Oleksiy, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you very much, Olga, for this extremely multifaceted and multi-layered lecture today. It was really fascinating to listen to you. I've recently started my research on Ukrainian Poetic Cinema at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt Oder in Germany, and I'm trying to get through it a little bit. And your talk gave a lot of thoughts to me in this topic. I have actually two questions to you. One is, you said that the point which I found very interesting, you said that filmmakers use the literary texts as alibi for dealing with them. And I wanted to ask if, in your opinion, there existed any list of writers or authors who were allowed to be adapted into film, because, for example, Kozyubinsky apparently was allowed to be adapted, Stefanik as well. In Poetic Cinema, there is also one film on Ivan Franko's Zahar Berkut, and also some Gogol stories are adapted into film, but not much, nothing else really. If you think or know if there was some list of authors that were allowed or that were still correct, I mean, yeah, the thought was taking place, but still it was not completely culturally free. So that would be one question of mine. And the second one is a bit broader, and it came to my mind because you mentioned Kira Muratova, and she basically started her career also in the same time. But as far as I know, she's not belonging to this classification of Ukrainian poetic cinema. So I wanted to ask you, because Ukrainian poetic cinema, you can read different explanations of this movement, and it was started by Janusz Gazda, but he maybe meant something different in his explanation of poetic school of film in Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, what is your vision of Ukrainian poetic cinema? What are the special characteristic of it? And if you see Kira Muratova also as one of the unofficial, let's say, members of this school. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexei, for those two really wonderful questions. With the first question, I'll be brief. I'm not really a literal scholar, so I cannot really give you the perfect answer to that, but definitely there was a established Soviet canon of the writers that were allowed, and those would be the kind of the, again, this absolutely fascinating social democratic tradition of 19th and early 20th century. Like, for example, Lesya Ukrainka translated the Communist Manifesto in Ukrainian, and then Ivan Franko translated portion from Capital, Marx's Capital, and those were much different than the later Stalinist version of Marxism that was imposed, but they were allowed because of that. And then there will be, like, for example, Panteleimon Kulish was not in that canon because he was kind of the bourgeois nationalist, and he was proclaimed there was nothing related to social democracy, and that's true. He was kind of owner of a lot of peasants, and he was quite cruel person, and in relation to them. So, and you can see that in his literature, although of course he has other merits with refined Ukrainian language. So yes, definitely, if you look at the textbook of school textbook in Ukrainian literature, you'll see all these canons. They were quite rigid and established, and there was this list of those who didn't exist. And I would say that not all the filmmakers used the literary text as alibi, and I see this kind of creative dialogue only in two films, in The Shadows and in Stone Cross. And I don't see it in Ilyenko, or he works with it totally in a different way. So that's also something to consider. And then with the Kira Muratova and Poetic Cinema, and I want to mention that Janusz Gazda didn't create the term at all. And I have, unfortunately, only Ukrainian and long history of this discussion, and it goes like, just to give this points, of course, the term was created in French, so-called French Impressionism, but it's closer to surrealistic movement, those like Germain Dulac and all this, Louis Deluc. They were talking about poetry and poetic cinema. From there it came, and because they were left-wing filmmakers and they had connection with Soviet filmmakers and Ukrainian and Russian filmmakers, that term came to the formalist cycle, and in a kind of slightly, because there was this Russian exclusionism or Soviet exclusionism, but there was a circulation as well. They didn't mention the French origin, but they were contextualizing it in the question of film language, and so there was this famous collection of texts that summarizes the discussion where the cinema is, which was the mainstream point in 20s, that cinema's closest analogy is poetry, and it's called Poetics of Cinema. It's from 1927, if I'm not mistaken, and the main proponent of that point of view was Eisenstein, but Dovzhenko, of course, was also part of this, and his famous phrase, "I belong to poetic camp," is not something that just random, because it's a part of this discussion. And the other side was Sergey Yutkevich, who was sort of marginal in 20s in terms of his vision of cinema as a prosaic and narrative form, and then he won this discussion. And then in early 60s, the term reappeared first as a revision of the film theory of 20s, and there is this book by Yefim Dyomin. I didn't prepare my notes, but it's called The Poetics of Cinema as well, or very close to the original original collection of texts, and he includes both French avant-garde and the discussion of 20s, and then he proceeds saying that cinema should be both, sort of like in a Shklovsky reconciliation manner, because there is this short text in Poetics of Cinema of the 20s by Shklovsky, who said, yeah, there are two types of films, poetic and prosaic, so let's be friends. And so by Yefim Diomin, who kind of was film theoretician, and he actually was very friendly to Ukrainian situation, and subsequently he was his PhD student was Sviatoslav Ivanov, who was head of the Ukrainian version of Goskino, and he was fired when Shcherbysky came, and he went to Moscow to write about Ukrainian cinema. It was not allowed to be called poetic, but he was kind of, I think it was called contemporary Ukrainian cinema, but he was kind of supportive of what was going on in Ukraine. But moreover, the first mention of poetic cinema, like in terms of let's describe what's going on in Soviet cinema, was related to Ivan's childhood by Andrei Tarkovsky in a very important but overlooked text by Neya Zorkaya on poetic and prosaic cinema. So there was like huge discussion, which I will skip, and there was a lot of nuances and guards that just captured something that he heard in Kyiv. He didn't invent the term, he didn't do much, he was just describing and reporting. And the shift in understanding of poetic cinema was, of course, the release of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, because it suddenly started being articulated with the ethnic difference, which made Tarkovsky kind of separate from that term. And during the making of Andrei Rublev, he gave some interview where he was really condescending toward the term, and that's an interesting story in itself. And then there was this radicalization, which came with the Parajanov's film, The Color of Pomegranate, and the Georgian cinema, the experiments in Ukrainian and in Russian cinema, and then came the text by Mikhail Bleiman, Archaists on Innovators, and then the whole story. But the extremely interesting moment of it is that the term poetic cinema was only one among many to refer to what Parajanov was doing in Ukraine and his students, because Osyka and Ilyenko were younger and his students, and there was like about 4 other filmmakers, including Roland Sergeyenko, who were curious and trying to experiment. And these were the associative cinema, which is kind of like an interesting, I think, kind of from the surrealist idea of association, but came to but it was floating around, and then painterly живописное кино. So and then there were other experimental names of this. So it's a kind of much more nuanced and multiple process of how it was named, and moreover how it should be understood. And then I'm going to Kira Muratova. And because this kind of Dovzhenko film studio version of poetic cinema was an articulation of the formalist experiment with the look for this which of quintessentially Ukrainian, or like the ethnic difference, or whatever this alterity toward the modernity. That somehow made Kira Muratova as something totally different. But the way I see poetic cinema And the way I see it is very close to Pasolini's version of the term, which an interesting remark, in Italy, people believe that Pasolini invented the term. And there's like, it's canonically there, Pasolini invented poetic cinema. So it's always kind of interesting to juxtapose the context. And I think his essay is really, really productive for interpretation. And maybe the free indirect discourse is something that Deleuze developed in an interesting way, but I see more productive. The more productive part is this idea that the poetry connects two opposing poles: the empirical, the kind of documentary and brute material reality, and the oniric, this dreamlike, the internal space, the experience of that. And opposing to that is, because poetic cinema usually quite often misleadingly is opposed to documentary or realistic. And then if you look at neorealism, there is so much poetry there, and then you get lost and we do not understand what's going on. What Pasolini opposes it to is a narrative. It's a story built around character, with the psychology, with dialogues. And that totally clarifies the situation, because you see a lot of documentary and empirical kind of matter in shadows, but you also have this sense of the dream space. The same as Stone Crows, and that kind of explains why the narrative in the film is so scattered and is of minor importance. So taking that definition of poetic cinema, Muratova totally fits into this definition, and that's something I'm also developing thinking of how they close Parajanov and Muratova and poetic cinema and Muratova, but also different, and how it actually is an invitation to expand the understanding of what poetic cinema is, rather than kind of make it as a label for some films. And I actually think there is a degree of poetic in every film, and that's also Pasolini's point. But so we can also look at the degrees rather than essences, and that's, I think, a very productive approach. And good luck with your research.
Thank you so very much.
There are no more hands up, but I just have a question which is prompted by your talk. This, when you asked us to look at this, the clip and see what we noticed. The axe I noticed, but I also was struck by how when the mother and the son are carrying the ladder, it's a visual foreshadowing of the yoke that's placed on Ivan and his wife when they get married. So in the same similar way to the yoke being placed on their shoulders in the wedding sequence, she's on one end with it and he's on the other end. They're separated by a greater distance. So I wonder also whether there might be some attempt to link the mother with the wife, who's not, and whether the mother is somehow sort of subsumed in the persona of this wife, who is not his first love, and is also a negative force in his life in terms of wishing ill or causing ill to happen. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Oh, that's such a, thank you, Rachel. That's such a fascinating interpretation, and I haven't thought about it, although it's wonderful. And that's geometric form, but you have greater separation, but still a connection. It's very beautiful. I definitely totally see it as exactly that's how it is. It's a beautiful, beautiful interpretation. And the thing is that I can, what I can say about The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, it is a film of repetition in variety. So there is, and I keep finding this, and now you just found another one, which is beautiful. I keep finding these repetitions, this kind of like the rhyme, but with the difference, and it's all, the whole film is built on these repetitions. Some of them, just two of them, but maybe I didn't look close enough. For example, if you take those kind of solarized film, which everyone remembers. It's in Korchma, in this kind of social setting where Ivan is supposedly killed, although he's not. There is this kind of jump cut, and we don't see any hit, any strike. And there is another solarized film sequence, and that's where the sorcerer, the Molfar, appears first, and that's his kind of seduction of Palahna. And the way how the Parajanov and Ilyenko, I should say, because he played an important role in this, manipulates film, shows the difference of the magic powers in these two sequences, but those are coming with the magic powers of basically look of Molfar, of the sorcerer, that is so strong that it penetrates the matter of the film strip. So it is something that's extra narrative, but kind of goes into the matter of the film. And you see, and this is the first repetition that comes to my mind, but you see this play of variety and repeating through the whole film, and it kind of goes like, it's how the film is built. So the York reference with the letter is absolutely fascinating, and one of those things.
Another thing I noticed, so I'm abusing my privilege as chair here, is the obsession with asking whether people have heard things. And certainly that's very strong in the early part of the film. How do we read that? Why are they emphasizing hearing in that way, do you think?
Yes, thank you. That's a very beautiful question. J.J. Gurga has a specific answer for that, because she interprets it as an acoustic space predominantly. But I actually have, I totally agree, and with her point, because with shadows, it's always many layers, and you do not choose one or the other, you just go further. I actually do have a text on that, which is also in Ukrainian, and it has to do with this collage that Parajanov made after making shadows. It's considered to be that he started doing the collages much later, but he actually did one right after the release of the shadows, and it's dedicated to Ilyenko, and it's called Imperator Ilyenko, which is a kind of rhyme to operator, which is the cameraman in Ukrainian. And it's, I think, Parajanov was beautiful in terms that they quarreled a lot, but he never said anything bad about Ilyenko. But he made that collage where he said everything. And there was this kind of big stamp on Imperator's ear. He was kind of deaf and his head was cut, and I think that the do you hear is can be understood only if you understand that in Ukrainian to hear is also to feel. It's the same root, the same word of the same root word, чуєш and чуття. Чути, to hear, and чуття is feeling, sensing. We have it's all in one word, so it's very, very connected in this sense. And there was a short phrase, it was not so emphasized in Kotyubinsky, but for Parajanov, who was, of course, his second education after his engineer failure was the opera, and he was extremely sensible toward sound, but he also was, it's much more than just simple sound. It's this ability to feel, which is the core of his, what he does with film. He's like, can you feel? Can you hear? Do you perceive all this? So that's his call, definitely.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any final questions for Olga before we let her go and have an evening? She's 3 hours. Are you 3 hours ahead or 2 hours ahead of us in the
2 hours ahead.
2 hours ahead. Any more questions?
I think we had such a wonderful conversation enough, and that was a pleasure to be able to think about these things and share with you in this time. And that's what saves us as humans. We can do that as well, despite all the horrors that go around.
Absolutely. And thank you. So let's thank Olga again. Thank you so much for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you, Olga.
Lots of questions. We all need to go and watch the film again and think about these symbols and the repetitions and so on. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone for being a great audience. We'll see you next academic year.
Bye.
Bye.